You didn't think I would drop it that easily, did you? Of course not. Ray tracing is here, and here to stay. Its dramatic effect and generally respectable performance in Metro Exodus that I covered in my video at launch got me thinking, is it possible to get Metro Exodus to run at 4K and at 60 FPS with ray traced global illumination being on an RTX 2080 Ti? And what about 1080p60 on something more affordable, like an RTX 2060? If this game is really Crysis-like in its scaling, how long do we have to wait until both of these scenarios are actually possible, if not? To be clear though, we're not going to be using stock clocks here really. The RTX 2080 Ti is going to be boosting to around 2000 MHz on the core, but is probably going to be under pretty often. And that, coupled with a plus 750 MHz on the memory, our little RTX 2060 is then going to be both shown at stock clocks and with an additional 150 MHz on the core and 750 MHz on that memory as well. As I mentioned in my review one day after launch, Metro Exodus's options menu really does not offer the greatest amount of individual customizability. There are just really too few options here, but those available to us still do allow for a powerful performance scaling, from the lowest of lows and to the highest of highs. So even if we are trying to apply very coarse changes to the game here, it is the place to start if we're going to achieve these lofty goals. The best place to start then is the overall quality option. The extreme quality preset in Metro is simply extreme. When going from extreme down to high, the quality preset here affects around 4 different visible effects. One of the most visible of these effects would be the fidelity of volumetric fog effects in the game, with extreme offering pristine and precise quality where you can see the smallest of tree branches casting shadows into fog volumes. Lower settings cut down on that. It just has a hazier, more diffused look that can be a bit poppy in the distance. So on medium and high here, you get a version of the effect which still communicates what it's supposed to be. And conveniently, it's also visually quite similar to what we see on the console version in the Xbox One X. This scene right here, dropping high to medium, gives us around 24 or 32% uptick in performance respectively. I would also say that the loss of precision in the volumetrics is not too bad overall. Here we're running at a cool 45 FPS at 4K on an RTX 2080 Ti with all other settings maxed. Not bad honestly, but this is just one scene. While going down to high and medium has other large effects on the visuals beyond the volumetric lighting quality. One of the bigger effects it has is on shadow map cascade resolution. Looking at this scene here in this cave, you can see the immediate effect changing the settings has on the quality of the shadow map attached to this point light. Extreme has rather crisp shadows, with very little visible blockiness, and is high resolution to the point where it sticks very close to the object's casting. Going down to Ultra, High, and then Medium shows a progressive step downward in quality, where it can start looking a bit more video gamey. From our previous analysis, we know that the Xbox One X looks closest to the high setting here for shadow map resolution, so going below it with Medium would be less than ideal. Shall our quest for 4K 60 take no prisoners in settings? Do we really want to go below console settings here to achieve this lofty goal? While the effect on shadow map quality and volumetrics is not exactly huge when going down to medium, it does have other more visible effects. When going down to medium from high, we can also see a turning off of grass in the shadow maps. This means that grass and shrubs no longer will cast shadows. In many scenes in the Metro, this is unproblematic, but in others it really sticks out. Also going down to medium sees a culling of screen space reflections. A lot of objects in Metro Exodus are rather matte, grimy, and dull, but still, this would be below console settings here, and would mean sacrificing the realism of many of the game's shinier materials. So perhaps medium is too low for this quest to hit 4K 60. I do have to have some standards here. But there's other quality settings to drop still. Looking at the scene again, you should also be able to notice another effect of turning down that overall preset quality. The range that Tessellation is activated is also affected by turning down this quality setting. Notice how the walls and small objects like the rope here gradually turn into their untessellated versions of themselves as the quality setting is moved down. Tessellation is still there on lower presets, but the range that it applies is brought closer to the camera. so it disappears into the distance quicker. In this scene, turning off tessellation means only around a 6% performance improvement on medium settings, which will obviously be more in scenes that have decidedly more tessellated objects, and more the higher the setting is overall. Metro is a game with so many tessellated objects. I would wager that this is one of the most tessellated games to date, where it is often harder to find an object not affected by tessellation than one that is. It's used on Artyom's hands and gear, on tiny little environmental props like door handles and keyholes. It's used to flesh out micro detail on ropes, and used to give proper silhouettes to craggy rocks, broken tree stumps, and reinforced concrete. Even hanging ivy leaves were designed with this use of the GPU effect in mind. Turning it off has a pretty severe consequence for visual quality in Metro Exodus. But all things have a cost. Dreams require sacrifices. Our quest for the mythical 4K 60 will mean turning it off. And apparently, they thought that on console as well, as it's not used there. With tessellation being gone, other niceties we have in the PC version above consoles will of course have to go. That nice looking hairworks fur on animals, well, we're going to turn that off of course, since it can be pretty heavy when there's many animals around, and it increases the chance for a more dynamic GPU load. Things we don't want if we're gunning for a flat 60 at 4K. Just staring at the mutant here, we can see how at high settings, no tessellation, and 4K on an RTX 2080 Ti, we're achieving 60 FPS without hairworks, where it otherwise would not. Advanced physics particles, well, we can kiss them goodbye too, as they have a similar effect of increasing dynamic GPU load. The last reasonable and available point for tweaking comes from the ray tracing itself. From the Metro Exodus developers at 4A Games, we know that the cost of ray tracing mostly scales with resolution. On Ultra, that means 1 ray per pixel, so 4K is going to be casting many more rays than 1440p. The cost of denoising and cleanup on that raw ray-traced result is also tied to resolution as well. This is why the high setting reduces the ray count per pixel to 0.5 and runs that ray tracing and one of the denoising steps in a checkerboarded, reconstructed manner. Going down too high for DXR is a necessity for trying to achieve our goal of 4K 60 here on an RTX 2080 Ti, as well as for keeping those ray tracing costs reasonable for that little RTX 2060. In comparison to other sacrifices we have made so far, this one is surprisingly minor, given how it is a technical halving of the current frame samples driving the ray tracing effect. Going from ultra to high in a scene like this sees minimal visual differences on the macro scale, and with all the features of global illumination being preserved. At the same time, we're seeing a whopping 31% performance improvement in the scene alone at 4K. The quality of the checkerboarding and the use of temporally gathered samples in reconstruction is good enough to even preserve micro quality. Here on Ultra, you can see how these knives thrown by me, dynamic objects in their own right, are casting shadows onto the windowsill. This windowsill itself is only being lit by indirect lighting from the outside. This is pretty cool stuff, actually. On high, those self-same details are preserved, with the only real hint that something is different due to the light swimming of pixels that is visible when directly zooming into one of the indirect shadows cast by the knives. YouTube may be killing this here in its compression, but believe me, it's there. For such a small dip in quality here, we see around a 27% performance increase. Not bad at all. And just in case we all forgot why we're here to do this exercise in the first place, this is what the scene looks like without ray trace global illumination. Yeah, a huge difference that really perspectivizes why ray trace global illumination in Metro Exodus is the largest and most apparent setting you can tweak in the game for visual quality. Sure, extreme and high settings have differences, and medium may turn off some of those nicer things in the world, but the single greatest visual difference is found by flicking that DXR toggle from off to high, should you have a GPU capable of ray tracing. So this is where we stand at this point. Essentially, we're going to be running at Xbox One X quality settings for many of the game's primary effects, plus ray trace global illumination set to high, and we turn off all those other nice PC niceties. If we load up the first level, we see the frame rate around 40 to 60 FPS at 4K here. but first impressions are often deceiving. The intro to the game is definitely not the hardest to run area. Rather, those areas with lots of objects and grass tend to be the hardest to run, as the level taiga shows. Here at 4K at the aforementioned settings, we can see drops into the low 40s when running around through the thick of the grass. At one moment, I even see a specific low of 36 FPS at its worst. Moving over to the RTX 2060 at 1080p, we see it faring much better in its category. It sees at worst drops into the low 50s with ray tracing at high, at these settings at stock clocks, in this heavy scene, and manages to nearly clear them up with the aforementioned overclock. There is even enough headroom here with the overclock on to turn tessellation back on in this ultra punishing scene, with only seeing slight drops. Given how the scene on the taiga level is probably one of the heaviest in the game that I could find, that means that less taxing area of the games like Volga or the Caspian Sea are a very consistent 60 FPS, minus those rare conditions where extraordinary scenarios occur, like the intense amount of alpha thrown up during a sandstorm. All in all, I would say that the RTX 2060 is just a tick shy away from a flawless 60, but it still offers a great experience, and we almost basically met our goal of 1080p 60 with ray tracing on. Something I cannot say about its bigger sibling in its category. At this point, I would say the goal of a pure, locked 4K 60 on an RTX 2080 Ti with these settings is unattainable. Dropping to medium would be sacrificing effects that even the console versions have. This is a general no-go for me. Even then, medium settings would not be enough to bring that frame rate magically up from its lowest lows to a flat 4K 60. This ultra heavy scene, basically the heaviest I found in all of my play of Metro, shows a low of 36 FPS. To get that exact moment where the game showed a low of 36 FPS up to 60 at 4K, we would need a GPU that is theoretically 66% more powerful to crunch out that frame in time to keep up that minimum 60. Of course, we're talking about a flat 60 here for the entire experience. Many other scenes would not need a GPU nearly as powerful. I think that this is something that could be standardized though if we apply that performance deficit to something repeatable. Looking over the benchmark for this game, which is actually heavier than the real game itself, we can apply that same standard we mentioned. Using our 4K optimized settings, the benchmark shows its highest GPU load in an outdoor scene full of grass, much like the gameplay scene earlier. Here the GPU took roughly 33.3 milliseconds to kick out its slowest frame. Extrapolating from there, we could say that a future GPU could run this exact same benchmark with its lowest frame time being around 66% better or faster. That would be 22 milliseconds or so. So a theoretical GPU would need to have its lowest frame time here be 22 milliseconds to achieve a more or less locked 4K 60 in Metro Exodus at our settings. Given though how the RTX 2080 Ti is around 35% faster on average at 4K than its predecessor in the 1080 Ti on the same process, we will be either waiting a full 2 generations of GPUs for that minimum level of performance, or one glorious miracle generation like the 7800 GTX to 8800 GTX transition that was before. In the meantime though, we can attempt a 4K-like experience maybe? That high pixel density of 4K and the prevalence of temporal anti-aliasing means having a native internal resolution is decidedly less important these days. TAA cleans up images very well, but has the tendency to soften, and even makes 4K images with TAA not look very 4K-like next to those that are raw and aliased. This is especially important as the screen is moving. Going back to our 4K on a budget series, we found that 1800p was a good alternative that looked 4K-like on a 4K screen while providing a great performance benefit. Given how this game has a resolution scaling option that works on total pixels, utilizing the 0.7 scaling option from 4K would just be a few more total pixels than a native 3200 by 1800. This would also keep HUD elements at a native 4K. Utilizing our optimized settings and running the benchmark at 0.7 scaling places our minimum frame time to around 26 milliseconds, and not that golden 22 milliseconds that we're seeking. When we load up the ultra heavy game scene in the taiga, we see just under 60 FPS here, with it dropping at its worst to around 50 FPS. So here, utilizing a 0.7 scaling brings us that much closer to our target 60 FPS. But it's still under 60 FPS in one of the heaviest scenes in the game. We're not honestly at 4K anymore, really. So what does this even mean, and what does it matter? At the moment, I would say it doesn't really matter. Ray tracing is just too heavy of an effect to be chasing ultra-high resolutions at 60 FPS minimums in Metro Exodus. In one GPU generation though, well, we'll be that much closer. As is, I think we're best served now by trying to achieve higher quality pixels rather than just more pixels overall. And I'm not alone in this opinion, as even a number of developers responsible for very, very pretty games have said something similar in the past. Is losing tessellation, which affects nearly every scene, worth a higher pixel density and overall clarity? Is losing real-time global illumination worth a higher pixel density and overall clarity? That is where I think the utility of resolution scaling and DLSS or other reconstruction techniques comes into play. When utilizing the benchmark with those same settings as before, we can see its lowest minimum frame time with 4K DLSS is around 23.7 milliseconds. So just shy of that 22 millisecond goal we had earlier for a more or less locked frame rate at 4K 60. Here we can see that DLSS runs better than 0.7 resolution scaling, which is just a tiny bit more pixels than 3200 by 1800. Loading up the game at that ultra punishing scene in the taiga, you can see that it's just under 60, or there for a surprising amount of the time, dropping into the middle 50s. Honestly, not too bad for being basically the heaviest scene in the game. The reason for this uptick in performance is unsurprising given what we know about ray tracing in this game and DLSS itself. 4K DLSS is utilizing an internal 2560 by 1440 image in Metro Exodus, which is then reconstructed up to 3840 by 2160. Since the base resolution of rendering is lower, that means we're sending out less rays at 4K DLSS than we would be at 1800p or by using 0.7 res scaling. Likewise, the denoiser is working at a lower resolution as well, so it is cheaper than our res-scaled image, which is not surprising. Even then, DLSS is itself not free, which can easily just be seen by running the game at 4K DLSS and running the game at native 1440p. It is indeed slower than native 1440p. The most important thing here, though, is whether the current quality of DLSS is up to the task of looking better than that 1440p, maybe looking better or similar to its closest performing neighbor at 0.7 res scaling, or looking like a native 4K image. Easily, right at the beginning, I can just say, DLSS at 4K does not look like native 4K with TAA. It's missing detail and that per pixel pristine look you can see on many objects at 4K. At the same time, I can say that it does not look also like linear upscaled 1440p. It looks decidedly different, where 1440p upscaled is pretty darn blurry and chunky. It even does not look like 1440p with some post-process sharpening applied to it. That has a rather different look. So DLSS in fact is doing some level of reconstruction and new pixel generation to make it look different and have a higher perceptual resolution. The comparison to 0.7 res scaling or 1800p is where things are interesting. Asking directly, we know that Metro Exodus is currently not using the finalized neural network training of DLSS. NVIDIA has said as much on their blog, so perhaps the quality may increase. But right now, I feel like it's kind of a wash between these two when putting the two images right next to each other or back to back. 1800p essentially versus 4K with DLSS reconstruction. DLSS looks sharper overall than the 0.7 scaled version here, presumably due to its sharpening filter. At the same time, it is a bit too sharp even, as you can see a light halo ringing in areas of higher contrast. Likewise, if you look into areas where there are stair steps, you can see that DLSS is in fact of a lower resolution than 1800p, but it has a similar visual, perceptual quality when the image is viewed as a whole. DLSS won't have typical TAA ghosting problems on alpha or trails in movement, but at the same time it still has artifacts of its own. Currently it has some kind of strange blocky look to certain transparency effects like these spider webs here. It also currently breaks a form of SSR on water, which dissolves into these weird constituent crosses that move around. Interestingly though, this really only applies to one river type of water in the game. Other SSR types do not have this bug, as you can see here, where the swamp water right next to river water doesn't have that same bug. Quite the odd thing. I'm not really sure which version I prefer. Which version do you prefer? 1800p or 4K DLSS? If you were to take away the bugs in DLSS, perhaps this would be one of those eye of the beholder moments as to which image one may prefer. One thing I do like about DLSS here at 4K is its performance. It has image quality better than 1440p, similar enough to 1800p perhaps, but it runs better. I imagine the performance differential though here becomes less and less important and more equal between the two as resolution were to go down and if you were to forego ray tracing, as we know that ray tracing functioning makes higher resolutions proportionally more expensive than they would otherwise be with it off. So I would say we failed in our quest here to get 4K 60 in Metro Exodus with ray tracing on an RTX 2080 Ti, but in doing so we learned a few things. When an effect is as transformative as ray traced global illumination, perhaps the quality of pixels is more important than the amount of them. We also learned that the game is going to take a while to meet those extreme 4K 60 minimum standards, at least a generation of GPUs, and that's without tessellation, without hairworks, not with the ultra decadent extreme and ultra settings. We're not even using the ultra ray tracing settings here. Wow. Those additional niceties may even take 2-3 generations before they're at 4K 60. And you know what? I'm pretty happy about that, as the game looks great now, and I can come back to it with a new GPU in a few years' time and enjoy its graphical splendor at even more fluid frame rates, and perhaps with the obscene visual density provided by 4K. Until then, I hope you enjoyed this fun, musing, and meandering video and learned a bit along the way. If you did, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to take a bet on how many GPU generations it'll take after this one till we can play Metro at extreme settings, cranked ultra ray tracing at 4K 60, well, write a comment below and tell me what you think. Also, follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. As always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.